Arratsaldeon, buenas tardes, muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Tengo conmigo aquí en el escenario Hélène Leroy.
I have Hélène Leroy, who's a curator from the Museum of Modern Art in Paris, and she was one of the curators of this exhibition. And on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, we have Janine Gutierrez-Guimarães, who's a curator of this museum, as you all know, and who works in New York. And she's also worked as a curator for this exhibition, together with Fabrice Hergott, who's the director of the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. He's not here, but he will be arriving tonight. So all three of them have made this show that we'll be opening tomorrow. And this presentation is going to be an introduction. This exhibition is the first of our program for 2022. So therefore, it is also the beginning of our commemoration program for the 25th anniversary of this museum. And why not say this? It is also for us a special point in time because it shows how willing we are to recover this normality that for 2 years has been disturbed by the limitations and by the uncertainties we've been facing and which we still have to deal with as a consequence of the pandemic. But in any case, we're very lucky to have this show as the first event of the program this year, and it's a show that Hélène and Janine are going to be talking about, and it's 70 works, fundamental works, that will review the history of this collection of the Museum of Modern Art of Paris with artists that are fundamental to understand how art has made it possible to model the culture of our time and which offer a view on the avant-garde movements that were born in the first decades of the previous century, at a point in time when Paris was the epicenter of culture and art in the world. So this is why it's a great privilege for us to have these works here that hardly ever leave Paris. And we would like to offer the museum and Hélène the possibility of seeing the works in a completely different context, like this museum. And our audience will also be able to see these works in our program. So thank you very much. Thank you to Hélène and thank you to Janine for holding this conversation with us tonight. I think that how they're going to organize things, Hélène, it's divided, the show is divided into 3 chapters. Hélène is going to be talking about the history of the Museum of Modern Art of Paris and the first of the rooms of the chapter, which is where the fundamental movements were addressed, Fauvism and Cubism. And then Janine will talk about the 2 following chapters on what is known as the School of Paris and the last chapter of the exhibition that has to do with Surrealism. Thank you very much.
Hello. So I am going to start with a brief history of the Museum of Modern Art of Paris. So, while the Musée d'Art Moderne de Paris was not officially inaugurated as a museum until July 161, the origin of this collection goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. Its history, it's a long series of initiatives taken by the city of Paris and acts of generosity by a large variety of players from the world of French and international art, including artists, dealers, and collectors. First conceived for the international exhibition of art and technologies applied to modern life, organized in Paris in 1937, of which you can see here the model on the screen. The Musée d'Art Moderne de Paris occupies the east wing of the Palais de Tokyo. So this building that you can see on the other side. This building constructed for the occasion of the bank, on the bank of the Seine, not far away from the Eiffel Tower. Until 1977, the west wing of this building housed the National Museum of Modern Art. So it's here the wing that you see from the starting point of the red arrow. As the city of Paris and the French state had divided the space in this way with a view to the creation of their respective museum. Why? Because there was no modern art museum at this time in Paris. No national modern art museum, no modern museum of the city. And since the mid-20s, the development of modern art and the dynamisms of the Parisian artistic scene had evinced a need for a contemporary art museum. And the Parisian artistic circles, so artists, critics, dealers, collectors, and curators, all were calling for a building that would be suited to the art of its time. So that's why there was an architectural competition launched in 1934, and who was won by a team of two young architects, Jean-Claude Dondel and Albert Aubert, supported by two experienced colleagues, Paul Viard and Marcel Dastugue. Their building displayed a classicism tinged with modernity, with monumental volume enhanced by simplified forms. It takes advantage of the sloping terrain with a majestically orchestrated central peristyle, as you can see below, dominating two long flights of steps leading down to the terraces and the water. The sculpted decoration features a large bas-relief frieze by Alfred Janot, a kind of stone tapestry, as we still call it today, representing an allegory to the glory of the arts inspired by the Muse. On the upper forecourt, Antoine Bourdelle La France overlooks a fontaine by Félix Pascal Févola, which feeds a basin surrounded by 12 female figures themed on agricultural activities in the different seasons. However, it was not until the liberation of Paris that these twin museums were dedicated to new forms of art in the 20th century. Why? Because the dismantling of the provisional installation of the international exhibition, which left the interiors of the building unfinished, combined with the war, the vicissitude of the occupation, and the difficulties of post-war reconstruction, led to a delay over a decade in the inauguration of the National Museum of Modern Art in the wing, located to the state, which opened only in 1947. And this museum was active until 1977, where it goes to the well-known Centre Pompidou. In the meantime, the city of Paris continues to host salons and events in its wing, so it was not a museum, but it was a place where you can always see art. And not until 1961, as I said, was the permanent installation of the Municipal Modern Art Collection completed and the museum opened to the public. Now, a few words about the Modern Art Collection. Originally, the City of Paris policy of acquiring artworks was initiated at the start of the 19th century out of a social concern with providing assistance to the artists, together with a decorative missions to refurbish and embellish the city and urban spaces. To help sustain its policy of acquiring works by living artists, the City of Paris began in 1996 to build up a collection of works for a Museum of Modern Art. In the context of the preparations for the international exhibition, this incipient collection was enriched in 1936 and 1937 with more than 300 works acquired from artists at the Salon and other events of Paris' cultural artistic life. It was then that the works which now form the reference points of the collection were acquired, among them The River by André Derain, Port of Call by André Lotte, Bluebird by Jean Metzinger, et Le Fou by Pablo Picasso, that you are all you will all see in the show. The project was supported and completed by generous gifts from patrons, like the Italian Count Emanuele Sarmiento in 1936, with works by Marc Chagall, Gino Severini, and Suzanne Valadon, all in the show, and the art dealer and publisher Ambroise Vollard in 1937, who gave us Picasso and Valta that you will see in the show. But that was the legacy of the doctor and art dealer Maurice Girardin, that you can see portrayed by 3 different artists at 3 different times on the screen. So a brilliant collector who was also an art dealer, a legacy bequeathed to the municipality in 1953 that provides the definitive impulse for the opening of the museum. It forms the kernel of the collection of modern masters, in particular the Fauve artists, the Cubists, and the representative of the School of Paris. I show you here a photograph of the living room of the Dr. Girardin, on which you can see the Modigliani and the Kees van Dongen of our collection that are now in the show too. So, with more than 500 works by such outstanding artists as Maria Blanchard, Chagall, Marie Laurencin, other Picasso, Modigliani, Matisse, Georges Rouault, Derain, Chaim Soutine, and Valadon. Since then, the museum has truly become the museum of a collection, which continues to grow thanks to historic donation by many other collectors, major gifts that have enriched the museum with works representative of the taste and sensibility of several generations of Parisian art lovers. But also the artists themselves, their heirs or their dealers have shown their attachment to the institution by contributing large number of work and sometimes whole ensemble of works, such as those of Jacqueline Brauner, the widow of the painter Victor Brauner, in 1982. Other, the one from Aube Breton Elouet, the daughter of the surrealist poet André Breton, who gave us so many works in 2003, and also the legacy of the widow of Giorgio de Chirico, Isabella Potzker de Chirico, in 2011. From its beginning, the collection, I have to say, has reflected the importance attached by the museum and its first benefactor to women artists. Today's collection, that's why today's collection thus includes sets of historic works by Suzanne Valadon, Natalia Goncharova, Maria Blanchard, and Claude Cahin. You will see all work of those women artists in the show. Up to the present, the MAM has pursued this dynamic through its scientific and cultural policy on acquisition and exhibition in order to constitute groups representative of the major historic movement of the 20th century for permanent display in the museum galleries. Here you can see some display of the permanent galleries and artworks that are now here at Bilbao for you. For this selection of around 70 masterpieces, we choose to present a group of work illustrative of the history of the collection, of course, of modern master, because we also are a museum of contemporary art. And we structured it with regard to the avant-garde artistic movements that arose in Paris in the first decade of the 20th century. So I will start with Falvism and Cubism that are presented in the first galleries. The avant-garde modernist movements of Fauvism and Cubism were born in the city of Paris in the first decade of the 20th century, echoing all over Europe and functioning as experimental laboratories of modernity. But before this movement became significant landmarks in art history, attracting large number of artists to Paris, the name chosen by art critics to characterize them were meant to be unfavorable and to minimize the new artistic research presented in the Parisian Salon. Indeed, for the Fauve, their new form of pictorial expression employed bold, non-naturalistic colors and spontaneous brushworks, while the Cubists aimed to alter objects and figures into planes that show different viewpoints at the same time and within the same spaces. And that this audacious freedom that was considered scandalous as it revolutionized traditional representation of portraiture, landscape, and still life. Now we start with Fauvism. So a brief history of Fauvism. After witnessing the works by Henri Matisse and André Derain at the Salon d'Automne in Paris in 1995, the art critic Louis Vaucel labeled the artists les fauves, or white beasts, as a marker of their outrageous departure from traditional art. In fact, Fauvism embraced the dissolution of shapes into color inherited from Impressionism and Pointillism, as you can see here, and used expressionistic and vivid brushstroke on the pictorial surface, as you can see here still in this big Valda. Similarly, as you can see here, the Picasso sculptural modeling of Le Fou, the Fall, conveyed an expressive surface modulation with reflective shimmering light that contrast with the geometric structure of the Chester crown. So that is, for us, the previews of the premises of the Fauvism. Furthermore, evoking intensively emotional reactions through radical visual form, the Fauve emphasize the expressive potential of color and adopt a painterly approach to their subject matter, as you can see here in Derain La Rivière, Émile Autumn-Fritz Autumn in Honfleur, and Vlaminck's Berge de la Seine à Chatou. All landscape coming from the areas of Paris suburbs, painted with radiant color. Now, little words on cubisms. In 1997, Cubism was born, a revolutionary approach to representing reality. Initially ridiculed by critics who criticized their paintings for consisting of little cubes, both Picasso and Georges Braque together pioneered the Cubist style based on their analysis of Paul Cézanne paintings, which were highly regarded by young artists at this time. Other artists involved with Cubism created fragmented composition in muted color as well as sculpture that represent simultaneous viewpoints of reality, thus revolutioning the rule of perspective inherited from the Renaissance. The still life and portrait, the traditional subject of painting, became the artist's exercise ground. In Braque's Le Ver and Nature morte à la sonate, he experimented with trompe-l'œil effects and different texture by imitating wood, for example. While, as you can see in Juan Gris Compotier, he included letters and typography mixed in with elements of everyday objects, such as newspaper. In the Auguste Herbin Femmes et Enfants, he visually manipulated the decomposition of plane into multiple facet and abstract form, following a lively chromatic range. Meanwhile, Robert Delaunay and Fernand Léger each developed a very personal form of cubism, radiantly colored in the former Nu à la coiffeuse of Delaunay, and in Léger, L'homme à la pipe, who are concentrated around tubular forms. Similarly, as you can see in the Natalia Goncharova, she opted for a simplification of plane in broad areas of color. This work was inspired by the vernacular art, as seen in this diptych, in this painting, The Femme Espagnole, two Spanish women, that was inspired by a decorative ensemble forming a screen, and this panel also blends the inspiration of the hieratism of Russian icons with the artist's memories of a former trip to Spain. Lastly, the monumental composition such as Jean Messinger, L'Oiseau Bleu, André Lot's Port of Call, Escale, and Albert Glaise, Les Baigneuses, The Bathers, brought cubism an aura of nobility owing to the size and proximity of this subject in the history of painting. These works and many others participated in the creation of our modern art museum on the occasion of the International Exhibition of 1937. And thus, they are marking an important moment in art history and in the history of our museum. Thank you for listening. I am going to Mrs. Janine Gutierrez will now tell you about the School of Paris and Surrealism.
Thank you, Hélène. Hi, everybody. So good to be with you today via New York through this wonderful technology. Hélène will kindly forward the slides for me, and I'll just say next. And then, as she mentioned, I will be discussing the last two sections of the exhibition. So we're now entering the second part of this presentation. So Hélène, if you can go to the next slide. Thank you. And the next one, please. Thank you. And so this exhibition, this section of the exhibition is titled Rendezvous in Paris. From 1900 until about 1940, Paris was a thriving center of artistic activity where a wave of artists of all nationalities gravitated towards the French capital. And what I'm showing you here is several images, photographs of Paris during this time to give you some visual context. Because of this enormous influx of non-French artists living and working in Paris, a loosely defined affiliation developed, and this was referred to as the School of Paris. The cafes and workshops and cabarets in select neighborhoods like Montmartre, Montparnasse, and Saint-Germain-des-Prés became the new rendezvous for this cosmopolitan artistic community. Gathered in this section of the exhibition, as you will see shortly, are figurative painters and sculptors who actively contributed to the blossoming of this new artistic scene during the interwar period in Paris. Next slide. Focusing on conventional subjects such as portraiture, figure studies, landscapes, and still life, artists of the School of Paris employed a diversity of styles and techniques. Here we see several works by some important international artists included in the exhibition, such as Japanese artist Leonard Fujita, Spanish artist Maria Blanchard, Russian-born Israeli artist Hanna Orlov, Bulgarian artist Jules Passin, and Italian artist Gino Severini. These artists intermingled alongside several other well-known French artists at the time, including Henri Matisse, Suzanne Valadon, and Marie Laurencin. Next slide. Among the iconic artists on view in the third floor is Italian Amadeo Modigliani, who painted Woman with Blue Eyes in 1908. Here's a picture of Modigliani on the right. And he arrived in Paris in 1906, where he initially worked alongside the Romanian sculptor Constantin Brancusi, who had been in the city since 1904. It was very common for other artists within the School of Paris to exchange styles and ideas about painting and sculpture. Modigliani's distinctive nudes and portraits of friends from the vibrant community of Montmartre display his characteristic use of bold contours, long oval faces, and elongated bodies. In addition to meeting Brancusi, Modigliani also met Picasso, both of whom were pushing this new modernist ideas forward and appropriating formal qualities of African art circulating in Paris at that time. Although it is hard to tell who the model was for this painting, the uniformly blue eyes and the auburn-colored hair have led most scholars to believe that it was French painter Jeanne Hébuterne, Modigliani's common-law wife. It is wonderful to note that the first owner of this painting was Dr. Maurice Girardin, whose bequest of works to Mom was fundamental as he spent more than 40 years amassing this significant collection. Next slide. Another important artist in Mom's collection is Spanish artist Maria Blanchard, whose representation in the museum counts with some 20 works, largely due to the generous bequest of Dr. Girardin. Here, you see a painting on the left titled The Basket Maker from 1924, which depicts a working-class family selling handmade baskets at the corner of a street, alongside a picture of Blanchard on the right. Blanchard was born in 1888 in Santander, and her father was the founder and director of the newspaper El Atlántico. She studied fine arts at the Real Academia de Bellas Artes de San Fernando in Madrid, and in 1908, the Santander government awarded her a grant to support her studies in Paris. She lived between Madrid and Paris until 1916, when she decided to reside in Paris permanently. Between 1913 and 1919, Blanchard actively entered the Cubist circle in Paris, and she became a well-known figure and a lively participant in the artistic avant-garde discussions of the time. She later abandoned Cubism in 1919-1920, although its traces and impressions remained in her work for a long time. In this painting, the male figure at the forefront sits on top of a wooden stool, weaving a basket to add to the rest of his other containers piling up on the side. A small child sits on his side holding a ball and looks up, while the mother, who stands behind her husband, holds their baby wrapped in white cloth. This work was originally titled The Holy Family, and the subject matter also recalls Christian iconography. Next slide. Additional works by Blanchard in the exhibition include these other paintings from the early 1920s to show the breadth of her artistic practice. These earlier works showcase her figurative style influenced by Cubist tendencies and incorporate bright colors and melancholic themes in her portraits of children, depictions of maternity, in both interior and exterior domestic spaces. Next slide. Another prominent figure in the School of Paris was the Russian artist Marc Chagall, who initially lived in Paris from 1910 to 1914. Chagall moved into a studio in Montparnasse, adjacent to Modigliani and near Fernand Léger, and quickly absorbed the stylistic influences of the Parisian avant-garde. He then visited Russia in 1914 and was prevented from returning to Paris due to the outbreak of the war. Chagall spent the First World War in Russia, and following the Russian Revolution, he worked with the Bolshevik regime before returning to Paris in 1923. And here you see Chagall himself on the picture to the right in his studio in Paris. His painting here on the left is titled Dream from 1927 and displays an overgrown hybrid rabbit donkey carrying an unconscious semi-nude woman in a seemingly upside-down world. His fantastic narrative of a pastoral landscape filled with neo-surrealistic motifs was typical of his works during the 1920s. His use of unrealistic perspective, sharply defined contours, and figures of various scale show the influence of the French artist Robert Delaunay, who is also included in this exhibition. The scene we see here also evokes depictions of the abduction of Europa, which is a recurrent mythological subject in Western classical art, as told in Ovid's Metamorphoses. In this story, Jupiter or Zeus is disguised as a white bull and lures Europa to sit on his back, as you can see here from a sample on the lower right. The bright colors of Chagall's dream add to the feeling that this is not a real world. Vivid and shimmering, these colors create a joyful and dreamlike atmosphere, which was characteristic of Chagall's work. This particular painting entered MOM's collection in 1936 as part of a larger donation of 80 works from Count Emmanuel Sarmiento. Next slide. The next and last section of this exhibition is devoted to Surrealism, properly titled Evolutions in Surrealism, which gathers a selection of iconic artists involved with this fascinating movement. Next slide. Surrealism was born in Paris in the 1920s from the writings of the poets Guillaume Apollinaire, Louis Aragon, André Breton, Paul Éluard, and Philippe Soupault. In a post-war context, this artistic and literary movement was formed with a desire to overturn the values of order and reason, as well as to illustrate the necessity of re-enchanting the world. Here you see a selection of works by such artists in this exhibition, including Francis Picabia, André Masson, Giorgio de Chirico, Victor Brauner, and Max Ernst. Breton, the theorist of this group, laid the foundation of a new aesthetic deriving from new inspirations and including Freudian theories in psychoanalysis, myths and symbols, the unconscious, dreams and their manifestations, as well as chance and divination. Next slide. This movement was integrated across all fields of creation and heralded new artistic and technical inventions. Here we see a photographic series by American artist Man Ray titled Electricity from 1931, which he called rayographs, a neologism that combined his own name, Ray, with the word photograph. For this set of works, Man Ray, who lived in Paris in the 1920s and 1930s, juxtaposed common household electrical appliances, such as an iron, a fan, light bulbs, or a toaster, directly onto photosensitive paper, and exposed it to light to create photograms, which are photographic images made without using a camera. Then he added wavy trails of power cords and heating coils, which are symbolic traces of the unseen effect of electrical current. He also included 5 images of his own photographs, such as the female nudes and other pictures he may have appropriated, such as a roasted chicken, nighttime signage, and the moon. Electricity is among the most acclaimed works by Man Ray. It is a dynamic assemblage of 10 rayographs that the artist made as a commission for a private power company that desired to promote the domestic consumption of electricity. At the time, most homes in France relied on natural gas, wood, or coal for lighting, cooking, and heating. In this album, Man Ray demonstrated how electricity, an invisible force, could be considered a modern medium that could effectively make a tasty dinner meal, cool the kitchen, or brighten your home, thus improving the quality of life for working-class Parisians. Next slide. Other artists, such as Romanian Victor Brauner, experimented with different themes by fusing images together that hovered between esotericism and symbolism, as exemplified in his painting on the left titled The Meeting at 2B Rue Perel from 1946. For this work, Brauner reprised Henri Rousseau's painting here on the right titled The Snake Charmer from 1907 as a tribute to the artist. The title of the work refers to Brauner's studio address in Paris, which once belonged to Rousseau. The main figure is derived from Brauner's sculpture series titled Clongómeros, created in the early 1940s, which combined the words conglomerate and eros, the Greek god of love. In this painting, Brauner's mythical creature, Conglomeros, is a white fantastical figure composed of multiple bodies and intertwined limbs that converge under one oversized head in this lush jungle landscape. An under-recognized artist in Surrealism, MAM dedicated a recent retrospective of his work in 2021, following their 1971 exhibition on the artist, with a focus on reintroducing him as a significant contributor to this particular movement. Next slide. Another international artist involved with Surrealism was Roberto Mata, who was of Spanish and Franco-Basque origin. This work is titled The Unthinkable from 1958, and it belongs to Mata's later period when he was focusing on more overtly political themes. Mata was born in Chile and studied architecture and design before moving to Paris in 1933 to study with famed architect Le Corbusier. While in Paris, he became familiar with surrealist artists Salvador Dalí and André Breton and was involved with the Surrealist group from 1937 to about 1948. As World War II raged on in Europe, Mata's portrayal of his immediate surroundings began to include cataclysmic and violent imagery with mutated and distorted figures in tandem with the destruction brought on by prolonged warfare. Many of Mata's works included biomorphic elements and explored the visionary landscape of the subconscious. In this painting, his palette is highly monochromatic with different shades of gray, emulating an oppressive fog, seeping through and around architectural and biomorphic elements floating about in space. The title also echoes aspects of the external world in post-war society and seems to prolong a meditation on the nuclear threat during the years of the Cold War. This is the only work by Mata in MAM's collection, which was purchased in 1967 directly from the artist studio and was recently on view in their exhibition titled La Vie Moderne, which highlighted masterworks from this period. Next. Lastly, we'll end this presentation with a work by American painter Dorothea Tanning, whose work, titled Evening in Zaragoza from 1965, entered MAM's collection just a year after it was created in 1966, marking a significant purchase of this artist's work in the collection. Tanning moved to New York in 1935 when she was exposed to Surrealism, and she later met refugee artists who came from Europe in the 1940s, among them Dalí and her future husband Max Ernst. At the time, Ernst was married to collector Peggy Guggenheim, who had opened her important exhibition space called The Art of this Century in New York. Tanning moved to Paris in 1949 and lived there until 1976 when she returned to New York after her husband died. Her work explored themes of the female experience in the unconscious, where her characters were often caught in states of physical, emotional, or psychological transformation. In this painting, an anonymous reclining female figure in a dreamlike setting lingers under the evening sky, with the creature flying above, perhaps tormenting the main character. During the 1960s, tanning created a variety of reclining females, some clothed, other nude, in both indoor and outdoor settings, also functioning as allegories. In 2019, the artist had a major retrospective at the Museo de Arte Reina Sofia in Madrid, which later traveled to Tate Modern in London, re-emphasizing her as a major figure in Surrealism. Next slide. To conclude, we encourage you to come see the exhibition in person opening this Friday to the public, where you can learn more about this wonderful collection from the Musée d'Art Moderne de Paris, whose works mark the first time they leave Paris for Bilbao. We also have a great didactic space exploring MAM's history in these important avant-garde periods in Paris, as well as an exhibition catalog that contains essays by both curators with all works fully reproduced. Thank you again for being here with us tonight, and we're happy to open our presentation to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. Juan Ignacio, at the beginning, when he introduced this this presentation, he referred to the fact that by bringing this exhibition here, well, it's the first time that we're going to have an exhibition of this kind from the Museum of Modern Art from Paris, and the fact that they've been taken out of their context, out of that building. I think that during the work that you've done, I think that new interpretations have been brought about and new connections between the works. Could you please explain this? And when you made the selection, because I suppose that that was very complex, because the collection is very extensive, and we have 70 works, it must have been very difficult to choose the works to come to Bilbao. That can't have been easy. And, well, putting together this discourse that is so fluent, because this is what our spectators will see when they go to the rooms. Everything is very natural. So how did you select the works? Well, I think that we started off with a wonderful element, that is that we had access to the collection at MAM, and it was beautiful. It was great to be able to work together with the Paris Museum and to open the show. So I think that focusing on the early avant-garde movement, where the wealth of the collection can also be seen, and which allows us to explain the first decades of the 20th century. And this was one of the directions that we wanted to follow, one of the paths that we want to follow. And from my point of view, I think that it was a magnificent experience. It was great to be able to learn, because there were many artists and many iconic works in the collection, in the MAM collection. And I would like to invite Hélène to say a few things about this too, because she was my Bible. I learned so many things thanks to her work. I learned a lot about this wonderful collection at MAM, and we now have the possibility of seeing it in Bilbao. So, Hélène, perhaps you would like to say a few words about that, about the selection process and how we did things.
Yes, sure. Well, it's true that as you were stuck in New York all that year, the help of the database of the museum is such a great help, because we can see, and you can see, all the collection online. And it's true that for us, the idea of masterpieces is not always so easy. Of course, the masterpieces are always exhibited in the permanent galleries, so it was not difficult to choose the Modigliani, the Chagall, but at the same time, we wanted the museum not to be empty, and we wanted to say something, not only showing pieces alone on walls. We wanted to help people to know much more about the museum and its history. And coming back to this history, it became easy to say, but if we just tell the story of the collection, and if we choose the first decades, it's okay, we will have so many masterpieces of the Cubism and so on. And then we wanted, you know, to include, because there are so many women artists in the collection, and today there is a need for people to understand why women artists were not so much exhibited. And as they were from the beginning in the collection, it seems easy for us also to add Maria Blanchard and Suzanne Valadon and Natalia Goncharova, because they were part of this history too. But we made this selection, and for example, when we were working on the Surrealist Gallery, it was not easy, because we have so many works about Surrealism in Paris, and we wanted to include Dorothy Tanning, and so we were considering with Janine, I remember, but that will pushed us the discourse of the show after World War II. Maybe it's too much for, you know, strictly modern art. But then, as a museum has also organized after war important exhibition dedicated to Surrealism, mixing, for example, young and contemporary artists such as Nikit Saint-Phal and artists of the Surrealist era that were always in Paris and that were always creating artworks, such as Dorothy Tanning, as we know. So it was easy because we said, but finally, the story of Surrealism has not stopped with the World War II. It was still very active in Paris in the 60s. That is not so well known today because the Surrealist period is much, you know, studied for the interwar period. And now we wanted to show that it goes on after World War II, and it was also a source of inspiration for young contemporary artists of the contemporary art and of the end of the 20th century. So maybe that would be a way for us to say you can also go to the museum in Paris and see other works that we have that tells the following of the story, and I hope that you will enjoy the show.
Bueno, si no.
Well, perhaps if there are no more questions, we could finish with this presentation. I'd like to ask anybody if you have any questions for Hélène or for myself before we close the session. Any questions from anybody, please? Though Hélène referred to this in the exhibition, there are quite a few female artists, and it's very curious to see too that, as you pointed out, Goncharova, Maria Blanchard were very recognized in their time. However, if you read through the history, in the case of Maria Blanchard, she was not recognized, but now she's come back in recent years. And in the MAM in Paris, there are quite a few women, and that's surprising, because Well, it's surprising to see that they were that important at that point in time. However, a time came when they disappeared up to a certain extent, and now they're back again. How can you explain that? Well, it's fascinating when you can review the history of a collection, because each museum, I think this is something that all museums should do. And when we do that, when we're reviewing the history and where we see how we started and how we're doing things and how we want to finish, I think that it's very important to take a close look at this collection in Bilbao. And I also think that we have this exhibition and the other exhibition, Women in Abstraction, which I believe is a beautiful dialogue. And I think that for both of us, for Hélène and myself, and when we studied the works that we wanted to bring, as you pointed out, we thought that it was very important to include this representation, this gender representation, because in the history of modern art, you always focus on other people, on other artists. So we wanted to tell these stories on modernism. We wanted to deliver these narratives, the narratives that we wanted to deliver through this very accurate approach. And that was very important. It was not only very important to have the representation of both genders, but also we wanted to have lots of subject matters. We also wanted to have many time periods and many dates included in the exhibition. And I think that this fits in perfectly well with the presentations that we've been given here. Perhaps, Hélène, would you like to say anything else about this?
Janine, I have nothing to add.
Bueno.
Great. Well, we really have enjoyed working on this project a lot, and it was beautiful to be able to work with the MAM collection and with the MAM workforce, with the director and with the conservation people, and also with the Bilbao team. It was excellent, and I think that this is an exhibition. This is an exhibition that has a wonderful team in the Bilbao Museum. And I know that they can put across our vision, and that's why we are very grateful to all of our colleagues in all of the departments in Bilbao. And I'm, well, celebrating the inauguration of this exhibition, although from New York, but I'll be here applauding you because I know that this exhibition is going to be a beautiful event in Bilbao. Thank you very much.